Mine closure is today a regulated affair, far from the laissez-faire that reigned up until the 1970s. But are the efforts bearing results? We asked Caroline Digby, an authority on post-mining issues. Caroline, welcome to Raw Talks.
Thank you.
We're talking about mining. There are a number of environmental issues, and we mentioned a few: biodiversity, tailings dams, water consumption, carbon emissions, etc. But we're here to talk today about mine closure. Is that really a top environmental concern?
These environmental issues that you talk about, water management, climate change impacts, etc., are actually at their most acute in the mine closure phase. So if you consider that mine closure is one phase in the life of mine, it's when we get to that phase where resources are leased and people's attention is focused elsewhere because they're moving on, that these impacts may be at their most severe. And I think we talk about mining being a temporary activity, but in many cases, because of acid mine drainage, water management in the mine closure, post-closure phase may be long-term, possibly in perpetuity. So I think mine closure is the key environmental issue.
Absurd as it may sound, it was common practice for mining companies to simply leave behind mine sites when operations stopped. Today, mine closure is largely regulated and a body of best practice has developed. What does a best practice mine closure process look like today?
I'm not sure we know what best practice is. I think we are still struggling to understand what good practice should look like. As you say, mine closure legislation is relatively new in the scheme of things. If you think that we've been mining since Roman times, mine closure legislation and compliance to decommissioning of mines until the 70s or 80s was a bit of a lock the gates and throw away the key approach. And so it's only in the last 30 years that we have really comprehensive regulation around the environmental restoration of sites. And obligations on the companies to rehabilitate and return the land to some pre-mining state. What that state is depends from one jurisdiction to another.
A mine closure plan is often decided at a very early stage in a project, but circumstances change during a life of mine. What happens with a mine closure plan then?
So the mine closure plans are now required in order to gain your license to open a mine, which is a very good development in terms of the legislation. But the mine closure plan that is put together at the beginning of life of mine is rather conceptual and high level. And we know that through life of mine there will be considerable change in how the deposit is mined and the external factors to the mine, etc. And so increasingly the regulator is focusing on how to get the companies to focus on continuously reviewing, updating and refining the mine closure plan to reflect what's going on. And part of that is to look at the opportunities for continuous rehabilitation. So the operator will be asked, how feasible is it to rehabilitate as they mine? And so the whole design of mine and the way in which the mine is operated is changing in response to this change in mine closure legislation. And best practice today is very much around how to do continuous rehabilitation so that everything is not left until the end when the resources are leased.
Now the focus of mine closure is on the rehabilitation of environment, but what about the communities? How are they involved?
Mine closure regulation to date has really focused on the environmental rehabilitation and the financial provisioning, and now increasingly what the relinquishment criteria are. very, very little and very high level references to what happens to the people after mining. And I think this is the next phase of development around mine closure. I know that the International Council on Mining and Metals is revising its toolkit on mine closure to
include communities.
The communities and the social issues. If we are to continue with the idea that mining is just a temporary use of the land, then we have to do mining in a way that where we understand what the life after mining looks like. What is the economy post-mining? What will the people do? What skills do the miners need in order to make that transition? And how do we make sure that the local communities do not fall into a dependency mode during operation, which then leaves them bereft and without hope post-mining? Again, these issues depend on how many mines are in the area, how long the life of mine is, etc. But we're increasingly understanding that in designing mines, we need to almost design backwards to think about how that place will look after mining.
You have actually questioned whether mine closure should be left in the hands of the mine companies, but rather driven by the communities themselves. How do you see that happening in practice?
If you are planning a post-mining economy, why would you ask the miners to take the lead on that? It doesn't make sense. We need to involve a very different group of stakeholders in the design and planning for life after mining. And that has to be with reference to the expectations and needs of the local community, or the local community who will remain in that place when mining has finished. And so I think that one of the mistakes mining industry makes is to be quite paternalistic and think that they know more than anybody else about what's going to happen or what's the best thing to happen. And for mine closure to be successful, we actually need to bring in a whole new group of people that looks at what the economics of that area will be after closure.
But it would mean involving communities at a very early stage and quite heavily involved. Are mining companies willing to let them in?
I think if you get to mine closure and you haven't built your relationships and engaged successfully with your community and understand what their needs are and what their expectations about closure are, you've missed the boat. I mean, I think your mine closure issues for communities are inextricably tied to social license to operate during operation. So if you have problems with your community and you're unable to work effectively with them and develop the local economy during operation, you're not going to have successful mine closure either. The participation of the community from the outset, from the beginning, the whole way through to the plans for closure is incredibly important. But closure is the area that companies don't like to talk about, and that's when they kind of step back from the community because they're frightened to talk about the prospects of actually this flow of benefits is about to come to an end. And so the structures that you put in place to discuss closure have to be carefully thought about.
We've now talked only about industrial mining. Let's look at small-scale mining. It's a very different chapter in this story, and it's a context of poverty. And it's very unlikely that the small-scale sites will undergo proper reclamation and rehabilitation. What is being done in the small-scale area?
I think when you talk about artisanal and small-scale mining, you have to distinguish between a number of different types of activities. We can see across Africa that small-scale mining is incredibly important livelihood, and I think national governments and the donor agencies are changing their approach to how we address small-scale mining issues and looking at formalizing and educating small-scale miners, bringing them into the activities of the economy. In that area, closure is becoming part of the discussion, and talking with the small-scale miners about how to rehabilitate is very much ongoing. However, there's an awful lot of advancing in between ASM encroaching on large-scale mining and a lot of illegal activity really causing problems for some of the closure activities of large-scale miners, interfering with technical solutions, the covers on the tailings dams. It's all very well to rehabilitate your mine, but if once you leave, a whole bunch of small-scale miners comes in and undoes what you have done, that's not going to be very good for the environment or water management, etc. So we have to understand the context in which small-scale mining is happening, and whether it's legal, illegal, formal, informal, and I think there's a lot of work to be done there. I've just been working for the last few years in South Africa, where illegal mining, the so-called zama-zama problem, is very serious. It's estimated that there are about 70,000 illegal miners working in the old deep shafts of the gold mines around Johannesburg. This is very dangerous, illegal, criminal activity, largely. And what we can see is that actually the problem is exacerbated because of very poor closure practice in the past. Now the state the regulator has to intervene to look at how those problems can be resolved. So it's a very significant issue.
Abandoned or orphaned mines are mine sites where proper mine closure did not take place, leaving behind environmental degradation. Who is to take responsibility for the cleanup of these mines?
So there are literally thousands of abandoned and orphaned mines in all the major mining regions around the world. That's not surprising, given that we were talking about mine closure regulation really only coming into play in the last 30 years. But these sites may be hundreds of years old and may have acid mine drainage problems that have been polluting water systems for hundreds of years. Some of these sites are enormous and incredibly dangerous and a very serious threat to the environment and biodiversity. Others are holes in the ground that have been left as abandoned shafts for years. So we have to prioritize which of these sites needs to be cleaned up. Now the owners are long gone, so the polluter pays principle is unlikely to be effective in this situation. Economists argue that we as society benefited from cheaper metals because these costs have been externalized, and therefore it is up to us as beneficiaries to look for ways to clean up these sites. There are some fiscal taxes on current producers in the US and in Australia that looks at raising some funds, but largely it falls to the state to look for the funding.
You were part of one of the most interesting stories in post-mining rehabilitation taking place in the last decade, and that was the Eden project. Tell me, what was that about?
So the Eden project is an amazing global garden in an old mine in the southwest of England. It was constructed as part of the celebration of the millennium here in the UK, and is an amazing tourism destination, a big global garden with the largest collection of useful plants, trying to explain to the public about our connection with the natural world and the planet, and how ecosystem services are so important to our daily living. I went there because I saw that this was an old mine and we could tell a great story around transformation, life after mining, and it would be a great place to be based, to start talking about how actually real transformation is possible post-mining. And so we worked, a small team of us, building on all of the interpretation techniques and stakeholder engagement techniques that Eden was using on a broader scale to apply it into regions and areas that had lost their primary industry. So we had the PostMining Alliance.
From the Eden project came a book with the name 101 Things to Do with a Hole in the Ground. Tell us a few of those things.
At the time when we started, most people could only think of one or two examples of successful life after mining. Many people said the Bouchard Gardens in Victoria in British Columbia. So we set about looking for much bigger stories around life after mining. My favorite ones probably were the big landscapes scale projects that were undertaken in East Germany, for example, in Lusatia, now have created the largest artificial lake district, I think, in Europe. And there are lots of other examples in Germany of the transformation of the old steelworks and coking mills, etc., in the Ruhr area, Zollverein and places like that. There are 16 World Heritage sites that are all mine sites. So that was quite interesting. Lots of interesting stories to do with new beginnings, entirely different life for mines as race tracks for testing electric cars, or a very interesting example of a hydroelectric battery for storing renewable energy in an old coal mine. Nice transition from fossil fuels to renewable energy. And so there are lots of different examples like that to inspire people to think differently about what could be done with the infrastructure and land that has been mined out.
Is it realistic to expect that governments put in that much effort in after mine closure?
I don't think it's the sole responsibility of government. I think we have to bring a whole different group of people into the equation to look at what post-mining economies look like. And it's the collaboration between the mining people who know what the environmental considerations are going to be, what the ongoing water management issues will be, etc., with the regeneration experts, with the new enterprise people, as well as the government and the local community who have views about how the land and infrastructure should be used going forward. But all of the examples that we have in the book, I think, point to the importance of the collaboration of very different people, you know, unusual suspects coming together and convincing people that significant funding should be put in place to have ambition around what life after mining looks like.
Caroline, thank you so much for joining Raw Talks.
You're welcome.
And to keep up with the debate on extractives and development, join us at rawtalks.org.